Hey, welcome everybody. This is John Paul Mendocha, Speed Selling. This is Raging Verbalist number 303 for those of you keeping track of it. And also that happened to be the area code where I grew up in Colorado. Anyway, just to put in a little bit of trivia there. Raging Verbalist is, I talk about topics that ping me, hit me, and do that. Rarely drift into politics, but hopefully make it interesting enough you learn a few things. Can always check us out on YouTube every week, and also my Facebook group, which is Position to Win Book, which shameless plug, that's my, it's my book. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, let me tell you that this is Halloween and it is 2025. I can tell you that this is a day that will always live in infamy for me because exactly 40 years ago today, I ended up interviewing for what would be my signature job, the job that changed my career. And it is a day that I will always remember and cherish and all of that. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got there and why it mattered and what it meant to me and why I'm here now. And part of this is your own story and thinking back about what changed in your life and how you can make these connections, if you will, which is important because it's easy to go looking for all of the things that didn't go right. Boy, there's a lot of those, but let's not stack those. Let's look at reality of what really went right. First and foremost is that I was working for the worst boss, and she will be unnamed, and she was absolutely terrible. Our styles, talk about not meshing, they were just awful. So I started looking for gigs and started looking for things I could get. Ended up finding a company that I thought would be a good company. They ended up rejecting me. Hey, not enough experience, not enough education, not a. There's an ironic twist to that one, but we'll get to that later. So I ended up getting a call about this company named Mercury Computer Systems, and they're based in Lowell, Massachusetts. They've since moved. I think they're in Chelmsford right now. That doesn't matter for the story, though. But anyway, turned out that this looked like a pretty good gig for me. And as I went and did my research, which I always do, by the way, if you're ever looking at getting a gig, always do your research ahead of time, know as much as you possibly can. And what I saw is that this company, though it was small, had some, if you will, opportunity. It was going to go somewhere, I thought. So I worked really hard. I talked to the recruiter and convinced her that that I should interview for the job. Interviewed with the guy who would become my best boss. The person who I had deemed the decision maker didn't make his flight, so I ended up having to stall and go back and do the next interview with him the next day, which was fine. I got that. And they said, look, you got to come to Massachusetts. We're a small company. What they didn't tell me is that the guy who I would be replacing had just been a bozo. I mean, had a drug problem and, yikes. Now, at the time, I had given up smoking. So, okay. And then they said, and by the way, when you come back, we're going to do a drug test. So I was a heavy drinker at that point in time, been sober now going on almost 40 years, but, you can only count today. So what I did was I said, okay, I got to, make sure I don't drink for a while. So, we're going to pee clean and all that. And away I went. So I flew to Massachusetts, of course, never telling my boss what I was doing. And I was going to interview on Halloween. Now, I'm sitting there in, Massachusetts at the Lowell Hilton. And, this was when Wang, the word processing guys were still hot, long gone, all of that. So, ended up meeting some people, for the evening ahead of time, trying to get some insight what was going to go on, and get there on the day to do the gauntlet interviews, which start early and end late. And I'm 3 hours off on time. Today that wouldn't be a problem. Then it was kind of a little rough gig, and ended up the person who I send gratitude to every day. In fact, I'll reveal who he is and why I do that each and every year, and why you might consider doing that yourself for people who changed your life, because he definitely changed mine. So I went through an entire day of interviews, and I had to interview all kinds of different people. I found out how small the company was. I found out where the company was at and some of the things that existed. But what I did know is that they had a certain vibe, a certain energy, and I liked the people that I was meeting. Didn't know if I was going to get along with everybody, but I think I was going to make it. Made it through the day of gauntlet interviewing, and John Monteleone, who was one of the four co-founders of the company, said, "Hey, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go back to the hotel, probably, get something to eat and then hang out, do whatever." He goes, "Hey, why don't you come with me?" And I said, "Okay, come with you." And he goes, "Yeah, well, come out to my house and we're going to go do trick or treating. We're going to go do all of those things because I've got kids. And I said, oh, okay. And he ends up picking me up and, in his car. He had a Porsche 924 at the time. Now I know some people say, well, that isn't a real Porsche. Well, it turns out it was. Anyway, and of course we have to go pick up his teenage daughter, and she's giving me, as he goes in and we had to stop here and there, and she's saying bad things about her father. She was 16. I mean, you got to discount like 99% of that. She's turned out to be, incredible young woman. Now, she's not young anymore because it's now 40 years later. So anyway, I'm sitting there going, okay, John, don't say anything stupid. And we get out to his house, and the very next day I've got to go pass the physical and the P test, so don't want to touch a drop. And he had, he was kind of in between relationships kind of thing. So he had a roommate, and this guy had a truck, and he lived in an interesting. I've never seen a community like this, but everybody had like 2.5 to 5 acres. So how they would go trick or treating is they would put the kids in the car, in this case in the truck, and we rode around the back of the truck. And I'll never forget John standing in the back of the truck with holding a jack-o'-lantern, pounding on the top of the truck to give instructions about where we're going to go and not go, along with his kids. I mean, this is like bizarre. And of course, I'd been living in Southern California long enough to know that I had, kind of gotten soft as far as cold weather, because it could be chilly in New England at that time of year. So we went and did all that, and it was quite interesting, quite bizarre. And I thought, these are my kind of people. I mean, John was my kind of guy. So ended up going the next day, did the P test. By the way, in those days, they didn't go immediately. So we did pass the physical, went over, and John had an offer for me and said, it's only contingent, is that if you fail the drug test, because it turns out the last guy had this, snow problem, a little cokey problem. And I said, well, I know I'm going to pass the test and do all that. Now, the reason why I remember this is that 40 years ago today, a guy named John Monteleone, because of going through that whole day and having him help shepherd me through that day with all those people, I'm sure he had to answer lots of questions, because I was a brash 27-year-old guy full of confidence, had to project that bravado. And I was this strange guy, because I looked obviously very different than any of the people that they had, even though they were, they were young, but different. Bottom line is that every year on this day, I celebrate by calling him on the phone, which I did this morning, bright and early. He said, boy, it sure is early for you. What is it? 6 o'clock? I said, 5. And he goes, oh, 5 o'clock. I said, yeah. And I can tell you, 4 years ago at this moment, I was up getting ready to go do the interviews, trying to look my best, slamming coffee to get some caffeine in me so I would be coherent and awake. Because again, hey, we stayed out longer than I thought we were going to do, because I was going to go to bed early and be ready. But because I'd flown in and everything. But it worked out fantastic. So every year I call him up with gratitude, thank him for changing my life. And that's something that I suggest to every single one of you. If you want to make your life better, think of the people who helped you out, and put a hand out, hold you higher, boosted you up over whatever obstacle you were boosted or that you had to get over. And make sure that you remember them every single year, every single moment that you possibly can. Because what it can do for you means that you will never forget that we all are in this together, and that there are some people who mean a lot, and that you need to take the time to remember that. And if you do that, you will stand out from the crowd, as I always did. And with that, I ended up becoming quite successful. The stock came through and, made me a millionaire. All of those things that I always wanted to do, things that people had told me my entire young life, John, that's not for us. And we're not from that, cut out from that kind of thing. Not my parents, but really my, people that I knew, which is why people say to me, John, how do you keep in touch with those people? And the answer is, I don't. I choose not to, because again, they were not lifting me up in the way that I thought you should. Now, I can tell you that one of the things that you can do to get yourself better positioned, because I knew all about positioning by that point in time. I had positioned myself carefully, as the right person for them to hire. And who better to know that than somebody who eventually would write a book called Most Businesses Fail in the First 5 Minutes. It just takes them 3 to 5 years to realize that position to win. Check it out. You can go get it physically from the website, positiontowinbook.com, positiontowinbook.com. You can also get it from anybody who sells books by going in and asking for the title. Get it digitally with Kindle, Nook, and Apple iBooks. Oh, by the way, the company that I interviewed was a company called Numerics. And I really thought it would be a good gig because they were looking for somebody. Well, Numerics ended up not hiring me. They said, no, John, not qualified. You're none of those things. The irony of it is that eventually Mercury buys Numerics and they just think I could have been there all along. But nope, I had a better path and I'm glad I did. So one last time, gratitude to John Monteleone. Who is that person in your life? Write it down, call them up. Don't be hasty and don't waste any time. And make sure that every single year that you remember that, as I will every October 31st, to know that my life changed for the better forever. And with that, I want to just thank you for spending some time with me. I'm John Paul Mendocha, Dr. Speed Selling. This has been the Raging Verbalist number 303. And until next week, with gratitude to all of you, and gratitude, of course, to John Monteleone. Have a great day.